February 3, 1943, Luftwaffe base Morozovskaya, 50 kilometers north of the Caucasus Front. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann stood before his assembled squadron commanders in the operations briefing room, exhaustion evident in every officer present. For 16 consecutive nights, Soviet bombers had struck their supply depots, fuel reserves, and ammunition stores with precision that defied logic. The attacks came in waves between midnight and dawn, 20 to 30 raids per night, each separated by minutes. Sleep deprivation had become a strategic weapon. Hartmann's superiors demanded explanations, countermeasures, results. Intelligence reports offered only one detail about the attackers. They were women flying obsolete crop dusters. Hauptmann Klaus Weber broke the tension with laughter. "Women," he said, shaking his head. "They send us women in training biplanes from 1928, while their real pilots defend Moscow and Leningrad. These are not combat aviators. These are farm girls who learned to fly tractors with wings." Other officers joined the mockery. Someone suggested the Soviets had run so desperately short of men that they'd resorted to recruiting from collective farms. Another officer noted the aircraft were POWs, designed for agricultural dusting and primary flight instruction, constructed of plywood and canvas. "Wooden toys," Weber called them, "were being harassed by children's toys." Hartmann proposed a toast. "To our enemy's desperation, which sends women in wooden biplanes to fight Luftwaffe night fighters. May their courage exceed their life expectancy." The room erupted in agreement. Within 48 hours, Hartmann's fuel depot would burn for 3 days straight, consuming 200,000 liters of aviation fuel. The pilot responsible would be a 21-year-old geography student who had already flown 418 missions of what would eventually become 852. What Oberst Hartmann didn't know was that at that precise moment, Nadezhda Popova was already airborne 12 kilometers southwest of his position, beginning her third sortie of the night. Born in 1921 in Shabanovka, Ukraine, she had joined the 588th Night Bomber Regiment after German forces killed her brother during the invasion. She flew with singular purpose. Every mission was revenge, every bomb personally addressed. By February 1943, Popova had survived engine failures, forced landings in enemy territory, and anti-aircraft fire that left her aircraft so damaged that ground crews counted holes rather than attempted repairs. On one occasion, her PO-2 returned with 42 bullet holes and a severed control cable that should have made flight physically impossible. She completed the mission. Her total bomb tonnage exceeded 600 tons. Her average missions per month, 53. German intelligence classified her raids as harassment operations of limited strategic value. German logistics officers filed reports documenting ammunition shortages, fuel deficits, and supply chain disruptions they attributed to partisan activity and infrastructure degradation. They never connected these losses to the woman they dismissed as a farm girl in a wooden toy. German night air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939, represented the accumulated wisdom of 4 years of brutal aerial warfare. Every requirement emerged from specific casualties and failures. During the Battle of Britain, Luftwaffe night fighters operating without enclosed cockpits suffered 37 cases of fatal hypothermia at altitude. The solution: fully enclosed, heated cockpits became mandatory. During Operation Barbarossa's initial months, collision rates between friendly night fighters operating without radio communication reached 12%. The solution: standardized radio equipment in all night operations aircraft. Across 1940 and 1941, Luftwaffe investigators documented that 30% of night fighter pilot deaths occurred during emergency situations survivable with proper equipment. The solution: mandatory parachutes, armor plating, redundant systems. Analysis of successful interceptions established minimum speed requirements. Aircraft slower than 180 miles per hour proved vulnerable to Soviet fighters during pursuit and lacked the speed necessary for multiple intercept attempts per sortie. The Junkers Ju-88 night fighter embodied these lessons perfectly: 300 miles per hour maximum speed, twin BMW engines producing 2,400 horsepower, FUG-220 Liechtenstein radar for target acquisition, crew of 4 specialists, defensive armament, self-sealing fuel tanks. Between 1940 and 1942, Ju-88 night fighters destroyed 357 British bombers over Germany. This confidence emerged from proven performance, not institutional arrogance. German engineers had built aircraft that won. While German engineers perfected these requirements, Nadezhda Popova was proving them irrelevant. On November 28, 1942, she conducted a raid against a German supply concentration near Kropotkin. Her POW violated every principal German doctrine established. She flew without radio communication, navigating by landmarks and coordinating with other pilots through hand signals visible only when aircraft flew within meters of each other. She carried no parachute because the PO-2's operational altitude of 400 meters made parachute deployment impossible before ground impact. The wooden aircraft offered no armor whatsoever, leaving her completely exposed to ground fire and fighter attack. Her maximum speed of 94 miles per hour was half the German minimum requirement. Despite these impossibilities, she located her target in complete darkness, descended to 200 meters through anti-aircraft fire, released her bombs with enough precision to ignite an ammunition train whose explosion was visible from Oberst Hartmann's command post 32 kilometers away, and returned safely. This was mission 273 of what would eventually become 852. German after-action reports attributed the ammunition train destruction to partisan sabotage. The possibility that a woman in a wooden biplane had penetrated their defenses and destroyed strategic supplies with hand-dropped bombs seemed too absurd to consider seriously. The Soviet response violated every principal German doctrine established. The Polikarpov PO-2 represented aviation design philosophy from a different era. Constructed entirely of wood and canvas, mechanics called it flying kindling. One incendiary round could ignite the entire airframe. The fabric covering offered no protection from wind, weather, or weapons. In an open cockpit at altitude during Russian winter, temperatures reached minus 40 degrees Celsius. Pilots suffered severe frostbite on exposed skin. Their breath formed ice on goggles and eyelashes, requiring constant clearing to maintain vision. The aircraft carried no equipment. No radios meant pilots communicated through predetermined signals and hoped their squadron mates interpreted correctly. No parachutes meant every mechanical failure or combat hit became potentially fatal. No armor meant machine gun rounds passed through the aircraft encountering only air and canvas. Specification comparison revealed staggering disparities. The PO-2's maximum speed of 94 miles per hour was less than half the German minimum operational requirement. Its single M11 engine produced 100 horsepower compared to the Ju-88's 2400. The aircraft design dated to 1928, making it older than most pilots flying it. Manufacturing cost, $5,000 per aircraft compared to the Ju-88's $80,000. Production time, 3 weeks versus 3 months. The PO-2 was essentially a wooden training biplane designed for teaching basic flight skills to agricultural students converted to military service by installing bomb racks and removing weight. Women flew these primitive trainers deep into German-controlled territory, dropped explosives by hand, and somehow survived. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nadezhda Popova transformed into advantages that made her untouchable. The PO-2's primitive simplicity enabled rapid turnaround impossible for sophisticated German bombers. Ground crews could refuel the single 50-liter tank in 4 minutes and reload the bomb racks in 3 minutes. This meant Popova could fly 5 to 8 missions per night while German bombers managed 1 or 2 sorties over the same period. On March 14, 1943, she completed 8 missions between midnight and dawn, dropping nearly 1 ton of explosives across multiple German positions. Each sortie averaged 37 minutes from takeoff to landing. The Ju-88, by comparison, required 40 minutes of pre-flight checks alone. The wooden construction that seemed so vulnerable actually provided unexpected protection. During a raid on February 9, 1943, anti-aircraft fire struck Popova's PO-2 24 times. Ground crews counted the holes after landing. In a metal aircraft, those same rounds would have ricocheted internally, shredding hydraulic lines, severing control cables, potentially killing the crew. Instead, bullets passed cleanly through canvas and wood, finding nothing critical to destroy. Popova later told her navigator, If I'd been flying one of their metal coffins, that bullet would have ricocheted until it found me. Germans designed aircraft to fight their war. We designed tactics to fight ours. By March 1943, she had survived 38 separate combat incidents that German analysts calculated should have been fatal. She was approaching mission 500 of her eventual 852. An official Luftwaffe technical assessment from January 1943 concluded the Soviet deployment of female pilots in obsolete training aircraft represented a desperate measure indicating severe pilot shortages and declining manufacturing capacity. The report noted that wooden construction and primitive equipment rendered these aircraft extremely vulnerable to modern air defense systems. It emphasized that physics remained immutable. Superior speed, metal construction, and modern avionics would always defeat slow, wooden, obsolete platforms, regardless of pilot skill. The assessment predicted operations would cease within 4 to 6 months due to unsustainable attrition rates. German analysts calculated their advantages: a 3-to-1 speed ratio, 24-to-1 horsepower differential, and 15-to-1 cost efficiency in defensive measures. The report characterized night witch operations as temporary morale impact only, primarily through sleep disruption and psychological harassment, but assessed no serious operational threat to German military capacity. Recommendations advised monitoring the situation, but explicitly stated that special countermeasures were unnecessary given the overwhelming technical superiority of Luftwaffe night fighters. The assessment carried the full authority of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium and represented the consensus of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. It was wrong. While German high command dismissed the threat, Nadezhda Popova was systematically dismantling their supply infrastructure. On January 23, 1943, 4 days after the assessment's distribution, she destroyed a fuel depot outside Krasnodar that supplied 3 German armored divisions. On February 2nd, she struck an ammunition storage facility whose detonation registered on seismographs 80 kilometers away. On February 18th, she bombed a railway junction critical to German logistics in the Kuban region, derailing supply trains and creating a backlog that lasted 11 days. By mid-February 1943, she had conducted over 480 missions, rapidly approaching the 852 that would eventually make her one of the most decorated pilots in Soviet aviation history. German logistics officers recorded these losses in after-action reports as unexplainable incidents: ammunition mysteriously exploding, fuel depots igniting without apparent cause, supply trains derailing on undamaged track. The pattern existed, but German analysts refused to attribute such significant strategic damage to women flying wooden biplanes. Their doctrine made that conclusion impossible. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error that would cost them the war on the Eastern Front. Their logic seemed mathematically sound. The Ju-88 at 300 miles per hour versus the PO-2 at 94 miles per hour created a 3.2 to 1 speed advantage. This should have meant easy interception and destruction. What they critically overlooked was that successful interception requires matching target speed, not merely exceeding it. The aerodynamic reality they ignored: stall speeds. The Ju-88 stalled at approximately 120 miles per hour. Below that speed, airflow over the wings became insufficient to generate lift, and the aircraft fell from the sky uncontrollably. The PO-2 operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour and could glide with engine off at 60 miles per hour. The Soviet biplane flew below German minimum survivable speed. This created an impossible scenario for Luftwaffe pilots. They could fly past their target too fast to engage effectively, or slow down to match speed and risk catastrophic stall. No middle ground existed. On September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad, Hauptmann Werner Schmidt attempted interception of a PO-2 at night. Schmidt reduced speed to 130 miles per hour, believing this would allow sustained pursuit. The Soviet pilot immediately throttled back to 70 miles per hour in a shallow glide. Schmidt's aircraft began showing stall warnings: stick shaking, altitude loss, wing instability. He was forced to abort the intercept or crash. His after-action report stated simply, target speed below minimum engagement threshold. This scenario repeated across thousands of attempted interceptions. Understanding this physics made Nadezhda Popova untouchable throughout her 852 combat missions. On April 3, 1943, during her sixth sortie of the night, she detected a German night fighter approaching from above. She immediately throttled her engine to minimum power and descended to 300 meters. The German pilot made 4 interception attempts. Each time, he overshot the PO2 by hundreds of meters, his speed too great for effective gun alignment. On his final attempt, desperate to succeed, the German reduced to near stall speed. Popova's navigator later described watching the Ju-88's wings wobbling violently as the pilot fought to maintain control. The German was forced to abandon the intercept or lose his aircraft. This tactic, repeated across her 852 missions, proved the PO2's slowness was its greatest weapon. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed. And Nadezhda Popova flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated German pilots was only the first of 3 advantages the Night Witches possessed. German night fighters had been optimized for intercepting fast Soviet bombers like the Ilyushin Il-4 and Petlyakov P-2, both capable of speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. The Junkers Ju-88 and Messerschmitt Bf-110 were designed as pursuit aircraft, engineered to chase and destroy targets attempting to escape. Their designers never anticipated targets that refused to run. Physics dictated that aircraft must maintain minimum airspeed or lose lift entirely. At 300 miles per hour cruising speed, a German fighter pilot approaching a PO2 would overshoot the target by hundreds of meters before recognition registered. Slowing to 150 miles per hour to maintain visual contact brought the Ju-88 dangerously close to its stall threshold of 120 miles per hour. Meanwhile, the Po-2 operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour and could glide with engine idling at 60 miles per hour, creating an untouchable zone that existed below German survivable flight parameters. Luftwaffe pilots trained extensively in pursuit tactics and high-speed interception, but received no instruction in precision slow-speed engagement, because German doctrine assumed no enemy would fly that slowly. At closing speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, the window for target acquisition and weapons lock lasted approximately 2 to 3 seconds. German pilots reported seeing the PO2 lining up an attack and watching their target disappear beneath their nose before firing solutions could be calculated. On March 21, 1943, Nadezhda Popova demonstrated this advantage on her 537th mission. Her target was a German ammunition depot near Novorossiysk. At 0142 hours, her navigator spotted a Bf-110 silhouetted against moonlight, approximately 3 kilometers away and closing fast. Popova's immediate response followed the tactics she had refined over 500 previous sorties. She throttled her engine to minimum power, reducing airspeed to 65 miles per hour, and descended to 400 meters. The German fighter made its first pass at estimated 280 miles per hour, overshooting the Po-2 by half a kilometer before the pilot realized his target had dropped below and behind him. The fighter's second pass came from a lower angle, the pilot attempting to compensate for his excessive speed, but the closing velocity remained too great for effective engagement. On the third attempt, Popova's navigator watched the Bf-110's wings wobble as the German pilot reduced to dangerously low speed, fighting to maintain control while trying to hold the Po-2 in his gun sight. The German abandoned the intercept after his fourth unsuccessful pass, unable to match speeds without risking stall and crash. Each failed attempt had given Popova additional time to adjust her course toward the target. She completed her bombing run while the German fighter burned fuel circling uselessly overhead, searching for a target that flew slower than his aircraft could safely fly. By this point, mission 537 of her eventual 852, this tactic had become instinctive. The PO2 returned safely, while the German pilot filed yet another report documenting target evasion through unspecified means. German intelligence categorized these reports as pilot error rather than systemic tactical failure. The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the PO2's greatest vulnerability: its construction from materials that belonged in agricultural equipment, not military aircraft. Metal aircraft responded to bullet strikes according to predictable physics. When German armor-piercing or explosive rounds struck aluminum fuselage, the bullet penetrated the skin, creating entry and exit wounds while simultaneously generating metal shrapnel that ricocheted inside the enclosed space. Secondary damage often exceeded primary impact, as shredded aluminum fragments severed hydraulic lines, punctured fuel tanks, damaged control systems, and wounded crew members. German ammunition was specifically designed for engaging metal targets. Explosive rounds and incendiary tracers transferred maximum energy upon impact with resistant surfaces. Armor-piercing ammunition wasted kinetic energy penetrating armor that POWs didn't possess. Canvas aircraft operated under entirely different physics. When bullets struck fabric covering, they passed through both entry and exit surfaces, creating clean holes without transferring significant energy. The bullet continued its trajectory beyond the aircraft, carrying its destructive potential harmlessly into empty air. Wood framing responded similarly unless the round struck a structural spar directly, which occupied minimal cross-sectional area. The vital systems requiring protection, engine, fuel tank, crew positions, represented perhaps 15% of the aircraft's total volume. Canvas tiers did not significantly affect aerodynamic performance. A POW could lose substantial fabric area and continue flying normally. Field repairs consisted of canvas patches sewn or glued in place, requiring 30 minutes compared to metal welding that demanded hours of specialized labor. German pilots repeatedly reported scoring hits without achieving kills, filing after-action reports stating that bullets appeared to pass through targets without visible effect. During her 564th mission on April 8, 1943, Nadezhda Popova proved this advantage definitively. Attacking a German supply convoy near Temryuk, she descended to 250 meters to ensure accuracy. Anti-aircraft fire from multiple truck-mounted guns tracked her approach. Her navigator counted the impacts as they occurred, 42 bullet holes total, with 18 in the upper wing fabric alone, 16 through the fuselage sides, 5 through the tail assembly, and 3 that passed within centimeters of Popova's head through the open cockpit area. One specific round entered directly behind her left shoulder, passed through the space where her torso had been positioned 2 seconds earlier before she'd shifted to check her bombing site, and exited through the fabric beside her right knee. Ground crews later found the entry and exit holes perfectly aligned with where her rib cage would have been. In a metal aircraft, that same bullet would have struck aluminum skin, ricocheted downward, potentially severing her spine or puncturing her lungs. Instead, it created 2 small holes in canvas and vanished into the night. The aircraft remained airworthy after ground crew applied quick fabric patches. Popova flew 3 additional missions that same night in the identical damaged aircraft, the patches holding against wind resistance and delivering her safely through each sortie. This POW would carry her through 51 more missions before being retired from service due to accumulated wear rather than catastrophic damage. Later that week, discussing the incident with her squadron mates, Popova stated matter-of-factly, "In their metal planes, I would be dead. German engineers built coffins that amplify bullets. We fly canvas that ignores them." But the third advantage proved most devastating to German morale and most difficult for Luftwaffe intelligence to counter. German searchlight and anti-aircraft artillery systems relied fundamentally on acoustic detection for initial target acquisition. Sound-ranging equipment triangulated engine noise to provide approximate bearing and distance for targeting. Standard defensive procedure followed predictable sequence. Soldiers on listening duty detected engine sounds, activated searchlight batteries to acquire visual confirmation, directed anti-aircraft fire toward illuminated targets, and scrambled fighters if raids continued. The Night Witches discovered a tactic that rendered this entire system irrelevant. Whether the discovery occurred through deliberate experimentation or fortunate accident remains disputed. But by early 1943, the technique had become standard operating procedure. Aircraft would approach their target area at 8,000 feet, with engines at full throttle, deliberately making maximum noise to ensure German defenses heard them coming and prepared standard countermeasures. At 3,000 feet altitude and approximately 6 kilometers from target, pilots would idle their engines completely. The PO-2 would then glide in total silence for 5 to 6 minutes, descending gradually toward the target while German defenders searched empty sky for aircraft they could hear but no longer detect. Bombs were released before Germans realized aircraft were directly overhead. Engines restarted only after bombs had detonated and the PO-2 was departing the target area. Physics made this possible. The PO-2's glide ratio of approximately 1 to 10 meant losing 1 foot of altitude for every 10 feet of forward travel. From 3,000 feet initial altitude, the aircraft could glide 30,000 feet, over 5.5 miles, before requiring engine power. At 60 miles per hour glide speed, this provided 5.6 minutes of completely silent approach. The only sound was wind passing through canvas wing surfaces, a soft rustling easily mistaken for natural wind or dismissed as imagination. Psychological effects on German soldiers were profound, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, then experiencing sudden explosions without warning or apparent source. On the night of May 2nd in 1943, Nadezhda Popova used this silent approach technique 8 times during what would become her most intense single night of operations. Her 7th sortie of the evening targeted a German command post recently established near Krimskaya. Standard approach with engines loud at full throttle attracted immediate German attention. Searchlights activated, sweeping methodically across the sky in intersecting patterns. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the air with tracer rounds and explosive shells. At 2,800 feet, exactly as practiced, Popova cut her engine completely. The sudden silence seemed impossibly loud after the roar of full throttle. Her PO-2 descended in darkness above the illuminated chaos below, completely invisible and inaudible. Through the open cockpit, Popova could hear German soldiers calling to each other on the ground. "Where are the planes? I don't hear engines." Searchlights continued sweeping empty sections of sky while her aircraft glided directly overhead, perfectly positioned above the command post. At 400 feet, she released her bombs. The explosions illuminated the faces of German officers who had been standing outside, looking upward at nothing, searching for threats they couldn't detect. The command post structure collapsed inward. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition storage had ignited. Popova restarted her engine only after clearing the target area by 2 kilometers, the sound announcing her departure rather than approach. She would repeat this silent approach technique throughout her 852 missions, perfecting it to the point where German defenders simply stopped trusting their own senses. Years later, she recalled, "We were ghosts they couldn't fight. They feared the silence more than the bombs because silence meant we were already there. They could prepare for engine noise. They could do nothing about silence." German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality. The contrast between design specifications and actual battlefield effectiveness revealed the fundamental miscalculation underlying Luftwaffe doctrine. The Junkers Ju-88 represented German engineering excellence: 300 miles per hour maximum speed, 2,400 horsepower from twin engines, sophisticated radar systems, encrypted radio communications, armor plating protecting crew and vital systems, complement of 4 specialized crew members coordinating through intercom. Production cost per aircraft reached $80,000. Manufacturing time required 3 months of precision assembly by skilled workers using advanced metallurgy and electronics. This investment purchased impressive capabilities but created operational constraints that undermined effectiveness. A Ju-88 night fighter could conduct 1 or possibly 2 sorties per night maximum. Between missions, the aircraft required 3 to 4 hours of maintenance, comprehensive systems checks, refueling procedures for multiple fuel tanks, rearming complex weapon systems, and mandatory crew rest periods. 4 men coordinating in high-stress combat environment accumulated fatigue rapidly. Average Ju-88 night fighter career lasted 40 to 60 missions before aircraft loss or crew rotation due to combat stress. Survival rates approached 60%, with losses attributed not primarily to enemy action, but to weather, navigation errors, mechanical failures, and the inherent dangers of night flying in sophisticated aircraft where single-system failure could prove catastrophic. The PO-2 operated under entirely opposite parameters. Specifications appeared laughably primitive: 94 miles per hour maximum speed, 100 horsepower from single engine, no radar, no radios, no armor, crew of 2 women in open cockpit. Production cost $5,000. Manufacturing time required 3 weeks using basic woodworking and fabric techniques requiring minimal specialized skill. These apparent limitations enabled unprecedented operational tempo. PO-2 aircraft routinely flew 8 to 18 sorties per night. Maintenance between missions required 7 minutes total, 4 minutes to refuel the single 50-liter tank, 3 minutes to reload bombs manually. 2 woman crews who had flown together for hundreds of missions coordinated instinctively without complex systems or lengthy briefings. Average night witch career encompassed 800 to 1,000 missions. Survival rate reached 96.8%, with losses occurring almost exclusively from ground fire rather than fighter interception. The mathematical paradox became undeniable. More expensive, technologically sophisticated aircraft delivered lower operational effectiveness. Simpler, cheaper aircraft achieved higher operational effectiveness. German advantages in technology had transformed into disadvantages in logistics. Building one Ju-88 consumed resources sufficient to build 16 PO-2s. Operating one Ju-88 for one night equaled the resource cost of operating one PO-2 for 8 nights. The Ju-88 conducted 2 missions. The PO-2 conducted 16 missions in the same time frame. These statistics were embodied in Nadezhda Popova's operational record. On that single night of May 2, 1943, she flew 8 complete missions between 2200 hours and 0530 hours the following morning. Average cycle time from takeoff to landing, refueling, reloading, and next takeoff, 47 minutes. Ground crew efficiency had been refined to the point where mechanics could fully prepare her aircraft faster than Popova could walk from post-mission debriefing to cockpit for next launch. 8 missions that night delivered 1,600 kilograms of bombs across multiple German positions. An ammunition storage bunker near Krimskaya, the command post already described, a vehicle maintenance depot at Moldavanskoye, 2 separate fuel storage areas, personnel barracks housing reserve troops, a railway junction critical for supply lines, and a forward observation post. German casualty estimates from that single night exceeded 120 soldiers killed or wounded, with material losses including 17 vehicles destroyed, approximately 50,000 liters of fuel consumed in fires, and an entire week's ammunition supply for one regiment rendered unusable. The most accomplished Luftwaffe night fighter pilot might complete 4 sorties in a single night under ideal conditions. Popova had conducted double that number routinely. By mid-1943, she was averaging 53 missions monthly. Over 23 months of operations through that point, her 852 eventual missions represented more combat sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters completed collectively. Her cumulative impact, tons of explosives delivered, installations destroyed, supply chains disrupted, exceeded that of many bomber groups equipped with modern aircraft and supported by vast logistics operations. She never missed more than 3 consecutive nights of operations due to weather. Her 852 missions were becoming legendary even among German soldiers who had never seen her, but recognized the pattern of nightly harassment that never ceased. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern that contradicted every assumption about cost-effective warfare. German expenditure attempting to counter the night witches specifically had reached economically catastrophic levels. Anti-aircraft ammunition consumption exceeded 2 million rounds fired at night witch operations specifically, documented separately from general air defense operations. At 50 Reichsmarks per anti-aircraft shell, direct ammunition costs alone totaled 100 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to 40 million United States dollars. Fighter sorties dedicated to night witch interception exceeded 1,000 documented attempts. At 500 Reichsmarks operational cost per sortie, including fuel, ammunition, maintenance, and crew pay, the total reached 500,000 Reichsmarks. Searchlight batteries numbering over 200 units had been deployed specifically for night harassment defense, requiring personnel, power generation, maintenance, and logistics support. Personnel assignments included over 5,000 soldiers diverted from frontline combat roles to anti-aircraft defense against wooden biplanes. When accounting for all direct and indirect costs, lost sleep-reducing combat effectiveness, infrastructure dedicated to defense rather than offense, strategic materials consumed in defensive operations, total German expenditure countering the night witches exceeded 50 million Reichsmarks. The Soviet investment creating this threat consisted of 40 PO-2 aircraft at $5,000 each, totaling $200,000, ammunition costs representing a fraction of what Germans expended defending against those bombs, and personnel numbering 80 pilots and navigators, plus minimal ground crew totaling approximately 150 individuals. Complete cost for establishing and operating the 588th Night Bomber Regiment remained under $2 million United States dollars. Cost ratio revealed Germans spending 25 times more attempting to stop what Soviets spent creating. Effectiveness measurements showed Germans had achieved 0 confirmed fighter kills on Night Witch aircraft despite 1,000-plus interception attempts. The result represented perfect asymmetric warfare, minimal investment producing maximum enemy resource drain while achieving strategic objectives disproportionate to force size. Nadezhda Popova personally represented this asymmetric efficiency in its most concentrated form. German anti-aircraft batteries fired an estimated 1,000 to 1,500 rounds attempting to destroy her aircraft during each mission. Across her 852 missions, this meant approximately 1 million rounds fired specifically targeting her. At 50 Reichsmarks per round, Germans had expended 50 million Reichsmarks, 20 million United States dollars, attempting to kill one woman. She survived every mission. Meanwhile, her bombs destroyed estimated German material valued at over 100 million Reichsmarks. Ammunition depots, fuel reserves, vehicles, infrastructure, supplies, and the irreplaceable time of thousands of soldiers diverted to repairing damage and defending against future attacks. Average United States Army Air Force bomber crews rotated home after completing 25 missions, considered a full operational tour. Nadezhda Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours of duty, without rotation, without rest, without reprieve. She represented more combat sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters accumulated throughout the war. Her 852 missions made her one of the most cost-effective weapons in the entire Soviet arsenal. $2 million invested in training, equipment, and support had generated $20 million in enemy defensive costs, plus $100 million in material destruction, a return ratio of 60 to 1. German High Command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets, and Nadezhda Popova had no intention of stopping. As German High Command grappled with the resource drain, frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the enemy they faced. On October 23, 1942, near Maikop in the Caucasus region, a rapid German armored advance overran a Soviet airfield that defenders had evacuated in haste. Wehrmacht intelligence teams conducting routine document recovery found materials left behind in a wooden operations building adjacent to the landing strip. The first document appeared unremarkable, a flight roster listing pilot-navigator pairs assigned to specific aircraft. An intelligence hauptman named Georg Richter noticed the names immediately. Every entry used unmistakably feminine forms. Lieutenant Yevdokia Bershanskaya, Lieutenant Marina Chechneva, Navigator Rufina Gasheva, Navigator Nadezhda Popova paired with Navigator Katya Ryabova. Richter initially assumed clerical error, or perhaps a morale document intended for propaganda purposes. The second document eliminated that possibility. Personnel records showing birth dates indicating ages between 18 and 23, along with pre-war occupations including teachers, university students, and factory workers. The third document provided undeniable confirmation. Award citations spanning May through October 1942, each mentioning specific pilot-navigator pairs, with feminine grammatical endings throughout, documenting raids against German positions with precision that matched intelligence reports about actual attacks. Richter cross-referenced these names against captured flight logs recovered from damaged aircraft over previous months. The same names appeared consistently across hundreds of documented missions. Each logbook showed sortie after sortie, sometimes 8 to 12 per night, with target coordinates matching German after-action reports of successful raids. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. These were not instructors or ferry pilots. These were combat aviators conducting the nightly harassment operations that had cost the Wehrmacht millions in resources and thousands of casualties. Richter's report reached battalion command within hours, marked urgent, requires immediate verification. The battalion commander's initial response dismissed the findings as Soviet disinformation or a misunderstanding of administrative records. Within 3 days, multiple confirmations arrived from different sectors along the front. A PO-2 shot down near Krasnodar yielded a pilot's body that recovery teams confirmed was female. Another forced landing near Armavir resulted in the capture of 2 crew members, both women, both carrying documentation confirming their unit as the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The pattern could no longer be ignored. Reports escalated rapidly through division to corps to Army Group headquarters. Each level exhibited identical progression: initial disbelief, followed by verification, followed by reluctant acceptance. Wehrmacht intelligence conducted comprehensive analysis, correlating captured documents with prisoner testimonies and aircraft recovery evidence. Their conclusion, delivered in a briefing at Army Group A headquarters on November 8, 1942, confirmed what frontline units already knew. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment consisted entirely of female personnel and had been operational since May 1942. General der Flieger Kurt Pflugbeil presented findings to assembled senior officers, many of whom had personally demanded explanations for the persistent night raids. Intelligence photographs showed young women in flight suits beside PO-2 aircraft. Captured documents provided organizational structure showing all female pilot, navigator, mechanic, and command personnel. Prisoner testimonies remained consistent across multiple interrogations. Verification came from cross-referencing aircraft serial numbers appearing in raid reports over 6 months, with registration documents showing female crew assignments. The conclusion became unavoidable. Women were responsible for the harassment operations that had cost millions in resources, destroyed strategic supplies, and killed thousands of German soldiers. The revelation created a crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that transcended operational concerns. The psychological impact manifested in layers. Many officers refused to accept the findings initially, demanding additional proof despite overwhelming evidence. For elite Luftwaffe pilots, the confirmation meant acknowledging they had been systematically beaten by women flying obsolete agricultural training aircraft. This represented professional humiliation of unprecedented magnitude. The propaganda implications troubled command even more. Explaining this situation to German public and frontline troops seemed impossible without undermining foundational Nazi ideology about women's proper roles and Soviet inferiority. The ideological conflict cut deeper. If women could conduct combat operations this effectively, what else had German assumptions gotten wrong about Soviet capabilities? Practical operational concerns multiplied. Luftwaffe pilots began requesting transfers rather than continue serving in units bested by female opponents. Some officers insisted on bureaucratic solutions, referring to opponents exclusively as Soviet night harassment units in official reports, deliberately avoiding any mention of gender. Luftwaffe High Command actively suppressed information about the 588th Regiment's composition, fearing broader morale impacts if the facts became widely known among German forces. Frontline soldiers reacted differently than their officers. Among troops who faced nightly raids, a mixture of grudging respect and intensified fear replaced ridicule. The nickname Nachthexen, night witches, spread rapidly through German positions despite official discouragement of the term. Some units began formally requesting dedicated anti-night witch resources and tactics. Others refused to acknowledge gender entirely, focusing exclusively on the tactical threat while ignoring its source. An operational order dated November 15, 1942, captured the command's desperation. Operational Order 4427. All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender. This directive issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale. The order's existence confirmed that morale had already been impacted. While German command struggled with the revelation, Nadezhda Popova continued her missions without pause. On November 8, 1942, the exact date General Pflugbeil briefed Army Group headquarters about the 588th Regiment's composition, Popova was flying her 432nd mission, completely unaware that Germans had just confirmed her identity and gender. She knew German intelligence would eventually discover the truth. Captured documents were inevitable over months of operations, but the knowledge changed nothing about her approach. Her perspective remained brutally simple. Germans needed to die, and she possessed the means to kill them. Whether they knew she was a woman made no difference to her bombs. By the time Germans confirmed her regiment's composition, she had already completed over half of her eventual 852 missions, each one adding to the cumulative weight of destruction she delivered. On November 11, 1942, 3 days after the German briefing, Popova conducted a raid against a fuel depot outside Mozdok that destroyed an estimated 40,000 liters of aviation fuel and 16 aircraft caught in the resulting fires. German logistics officers attributed the loss to sabotage, unable to accept that a woman had penetrated their defenses and caused such devastation. Her perspective, shared with her navigator after learning Germans knew about the regiment: "We didn't fly to prove women could fight. We flew to kill fascists. Whether they knew we were women made no difference to our bombs." The discovery changed nothing operationally. The night witches continued flying, and Germans continued dying. After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collected testimonies from German prisoners during systematic debriefings conducted between 1945 and 1946. When interrogators asked former Wehrmacht personnel about Eastern Front experiences, specifically about night operations and defensive measures against Soviet bombers, an unexpected pattern emerged. Even hardened SS officers showed visible reactions when questions turned to the night witches. Across hundreds of interviews, consistency in responses revealed shared trauma. Interrogators documented that regardless of rank, unit, or ideology, German soldiers who had faced nightly harassment operations described similar experiences and exhibited similar psychological responses. Oberleutnant Franz Hoffmann, a Ju-88 pilot from Night Fighter Group 4, captured near Berlin in May 1945, provided representative testimony. "We received orders to intercept these aircraft in autumn 1942. Command didn't tell us they were women. We only learned after the war ended. I attempted interception 17 times, 17 failures. The aircraft were too slow for engagement. My stall warnings would activate every time I tried to match their speed. It was humiliating. You train for years to master the Ju-88. You face British Lancaster bombers over Germany. You understand air combat doctrine and tactics. Then a wooden biplane from 1928 makes you look foolish. When I learned after surrender they were women, I had no words. We couldn't catch them because physics wouldn't let us. Gender was irrelevant. They had beaten the laws of aerodynamics itself. That's what haunts me. Not that they were women, but that our entire system failed against their simplicity." Hauptmann Wilhelm Becker, flak battery commander who served in the eastern Ukraine sector, described different aspects of the same operational failure. "My battery fired an estimated 40,000 rounds at these aircraft between October 1942 and March 1943. We achieved perhaps 4 confirmed hits across 6 months. They would approach with engines audible at full power. We would prepare our targeting solutions, then complete silence. We would fire at where calculations suggested they should be, but we were shooting at ghosts. The sound would return only after bombs exploded. Psychological effect on my men became severe. Soldiers refused to sleep even during supposed rest periods. We feared the silence more than the bombs because silence meant they were already overhead. Learning they were women only added to the sense that we had fundamentally underestimated everything about this enemy." The pattern in testimonies revealed themes that transcended individual experiences. Nearly every German soldier who faced night witch operations mentioned silence and its psychological impact as primary factors in their fear. Repeated descriptions of failed interceptions attributed failures specifically to speed differential rather than pilot skill or luck. Almost universal shock manifested when prisoners learned the gender of their opponents. Many attempted to rationalize after the fact, suggesting Soviet propaganda had exaggerated female involvement, or that women flew only symbolic missions while men conducted actual combat operations. Others admitted more honestly that gender made no operational difference. The tactics were effective regardless of who employed them. Common phrases appeared across testimonies. "We couldn't catch what we couldn't match in speed." Several testimonies mentioned specific Night Witch aircraft identified by distinctive markings or repair patterns. Acknowledgement emerged, sometimes reluctantly, that German propaganda about Soviet military inferiority had been catastrophically wrong. Some testimonies referenced Nadezhda Popova specifically, though often without knowing her name. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, infantry officer from the 73rd Infantry Division operating near Krimskaya, provided detailed observations. There was one aircraft we learned to recognize. It had a distinctive pattern of canvas patches on both upper wings, visible when searchlights caught it. This aircraft appeared over our positions at least twice weekly. We began calling it the persistent ghost because it would arrive in complete silence. I witnessed this aircraft's attacks 11 times personally. On February 9, 1943, it destroyed our ammunition depot, killing 19 men in the secondary explosions. On April 3rd, it hit our command post, killing 3 officers, including our battalion commander. After the war, I obtained access to Soviet records through a former prisoner who'd been repatriated. I learned this was likely Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova. She had flown over 852 missions. 852. I cannot comprehend that number. We never came close to shooting her down. She was untouchable. Learning she was a woman somehow made it worse, not because women cannot fight, but because our entire military system with all its technology and training and resources failed against her wooden biplane. Popova learned about German prisoner testimonies through post-war discussions with Soviet intelligence officers who had conducted interrogations. Her response demonstrated the same pragmatic focus that had characterized her wartime service. She continued flying after the war ended, transitioning to transport aircraft and eventually civilian aviation, accumulating flight hours that dwarfed even her combat record. When asked about German soldiers who had tried to kill her, and now spoke of her with something approaching respect, she dismissed the sentiment. We did what needed doing. Whether they respected us or feared us or were humiliated by us was their concern. Our concern was victory. They chose to invade. We chose to defend. The mathematics was simple. Her 852 missions, including the 8 sorties she flew in a single night that had become legendary among Soviet aviators, became documented not just in Soviet records but in German testimonies that confirmed what frontline troops had known throughout the war. The wooden biplanes they'd ridiculed had been deadly. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The Night Witches weren't anomalies or propaganda. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front, and Nadezhda Popova was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nadezhda Popova's final record stood as testament to what Germans had dismissed as impossible 3 years earlier. 852 combat missions. The number defied comprehension. Each sortie had carried the possibility of death from anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, weather, or the ever-present threat of German fighters. Across 3 years of continuous operations from May 1942 through May 1945, she had flown an average of 28 missions monthly, never missing more than 3 consecutive nights, except when weather made flight physically impossible. Her total flight hours exceeded 1,800 hours in combat conditions. The bombs she dropped personally totaled over 170 tons of high explosives delivered with precision against German positions. She survived aircraft damage on 38 separate occasions, including the mission where 42 bullets passed through her PO2 without striking anything vital. She received the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the Order of the Red Banner twice, the Order of the Red Star, and multiple campaign medals. The physical toll was permanent. Severe frostbite scarring on her hands and face from exposure in the open cockpit at -40 degrees, partial hearing loss from 3 years of engine noise without protection, and injuries from 2 forced landings behind enemy lines from which she walked back to Soviet positions. The psychological resilience required to climb into that wooden cockpit for the 852nd time, knowing that each mission could end in fire and death, exceeded what most humans could sustain. 32 of her comrades from the 588th Regiment died during the war. She attended their funerals between missions and continued flying the next night. To understand the magnitude of 852 missions, context matters. The most accomplished German night fighter pilots completed 40 to 60 missions over their entire careers before death, injury, or rotation ended their service. The United States Army Air Force rotated bomber crews home after 25 missions, considered a complete tour of duty. Nadezhda Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours without rotation, without rest, without reprieve. The average Soviet bomber pilot flew 150 to 300 missions. She exceeded that by over 500, even within the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, where the average pilot completed 500 to 600 missions. Popova's 852 stood out. She flew more missions than some entire bomber groups combined. If each mission averaged 2 hours including flight time and ground operations, she spent over 1,700 hours in active combat. At 200 kilograms of bombs per sortie, she personally delivered 170 tons of explosives onto German positions. German forces fired an estimated 1 million rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition, attempting to kill her specifically, expending $20 million trying to destroy one woman in a $5,000 aircraft. They failed. Meanwhile, her bombs destroyed ammunition depots whose explosions were visible from 30 kilometers away, fuel reserves that burned for days, vehicles by the dozens, infrastructure that took months to rebuild, and an estimated 500 German soldiers killed or wounded through her missions alone. By any metric, Nadezhda Popova's operational record represented one of the most sustained combat performances in aviation history, and she achieved it in an aircraft Germans considered too primitive to matter. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated Soviet High Command's controversial decision to deploy women in combat roles. Between May 1942 and May 1945, the regiment flew approximately 23,000 combat sorties, more than many conventional bomber units twice their size. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions. Conservative estimates suggest they inflicted 5,000 German casualties killed or wounded, though the actual number likely exceeded that when accounting for secondary effects of destroyed ammunition and fuel depots. Material destroyed included hundreds of ammunition dumps, thousands of vehicles, countless installations, and supply infrastructure whose loss created cascading failures in German logistics. The regiment operated continuously for 3 years without pause except for weather. 32 personnel died from the regiment's approximately 80 pilots and navigators, producing a survival rate of 96.8%. Conventional Soviet bomber units suffered 40 to 60% casualties. The cost effectiveness was staggering. The entire regiment cost approximately $2 million to equip and operate, while inflicting damage worth over $50 million and forcing Germans to expend 125 million Reichsmarks in defensive measures. The cost ratio reached 1 to 60. For every dollar Soviets invested, Germans spent 60 attempting to counter the threat. German fighters achieved 0 confirmed aerial kills of Night Witch aircraft despite over 1,000 interception attempts. Almost all regiment casualties came from ground fire, not air combat, validating the stall speed paradox that made them untouchable to fighters. The strategic impact transcended statistics. German troops suffered degraded morale and chronic sleep deprivation that reduced combat effectiveness. 5,000 German soldiers remained tied down in anti-aircraft defense roles rather than frontline combat. Supply lines required longer, more vulnerable routes to avoid known Night Witch operating areas. The propaganda value proved immense. Soviet women could fight effectively, boosting Soviet morale while undermining German claims of superiority. The 588th Regiment exposed fundamental flaws in German intelligence and doctrine that had dismissed threats based on preconceptions. Marshal Georgy Zhukov reportedly noted in his memoirs, "The Night Witches achieved strategic impact disproportionate to their numbers. They cost us almost nothing and cost the Germans everything they spent trying to stop them." The regiment proved that in warfare, technological superiority matters less than tactical innovation, and determination can overcome engineering. Nadezhda Popova's 852 missions embodied this principle. After the war ended, Nadezhda Popova faced a different kind of challenge, returning to a world no longer defined by nightly combat. Initial recognition came swiftly. Hero of the Soviet Union medals, victory parades through Moscow, speeches before crowds celebrating Soviet triumph. But transitioning from 3 years of nightly missions to civilian life proved harder than surviving the war. She chose to remain in aviation, becoming a flying instructor and eventually a test pilot, unable to imagine life away from aircraft. In 1946, she married Semyon Kravchenko, a navigator from a Soviet bomber regiment who understood the psychological cost of sustained combat. They had 2 children. For decades, she rarely spoke publicly about her wartime experiences, finding that civilians couldn't comprehend what 852 missions meant. She maintained close relationships with surviving Night Witch squadron mates, meeting annually to remember the 32 who never returned. Soviet recognition fluctuated with political climate. Stalin suppressed some war heroes who gained too much independent fame, though Popova's record proved too documented and public to erase completely. She received multiple additional honors through the 1950s and 1960s. Her story appeared in official Soviet military histories as proof of socialist equality and women's capabilities. By the 1970s and 1980s, she had become more comfortable discussing her service, participating in documentaries and speaking to young pilots. She lived in Moscow, maintaining her pilot's license and flying recreationally into her 70s. She died in 2013 at age 91, having lived 68 years after her final combat mission. Russia honored her with a state funeral. The town of Shabanovka, where she was born, renamed streets in her honor. For decades, the Night Witches remained virtually unknown in the West. Cold War tensions meant their story was dismissed as Soviet propaganda, another exaggeration from a regime known for inflating achievements. During the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policies allowed more wartime stories to emerge. The 1990s brought access to Soviet archives after the USSR's collapse. Historians could finally cross-reference Soviet accounts with captured German documents and prisoner testimonies. The stories validated. German after-action reports matched Soviet mission records. Prisoner testimonies describing wooden biplanes and failed interceptions confirmed Soviet operational procedures. By the 2000s, multiple books began documenting Night Witch operations for Western audiences. German testimonies proved crucial, providing external verification that eliminated doubts about propaganda. The regiment's 852 missions per pilot, 23,000 total sorties, and near-perfect survival rate were documented fact, not embellishment. Museums featured their story, including Russia's Central Armed Forces Museum and the Monino Air Force Museum outside Moscow. Monuments appeared across former Soviet territories honoring the regiment. Multiple films and documentaries brought the Night Witches to international attention. Nadezhda Popova became the regiment's most recognized member due to her mission count and longevity, giving interviews to international media in her later years. By the 2010s, her story had entered popular consciousness as one of history's most remarkable combat records. The story of Nadezhda Popova and the Night Witches transcends its historical moment, offering lessons that remain relevant. About warfare. Asymmetric tactics can defeat technological superiority when applied intelligently. The POWs' primitive construction became advantage rather than liability. Psychological impact sometimes exceeds physical damage. German sleep deprivation and morale degradation mattered as much as destroyed supplies. Innovation matters more than resources. The Night Witch's silent gliding tactic cost nothing but rendered millions of Reichsmarks in defensive systems useless. About underestimation. Germans' assumptions about gender and aircraft primitiveness created strategic blindness. They couldn't conceive that women in wooden biplanes represented serious threats, so they missed the threat until it had cost them dearly. Prejudice creates exploitable vulnerabilities. Never dismiss enemies based on preconceptions. About determination. Flying 852 missions required extraordinary resilience. Each mission carried death's possibility, yet Popova climbed into that cockpit night after night for 3 years. The physical toll, frostbite, hearing damage, injuries, was permanent. The psychological weight of watching comrades die while continuing to fly exceeded most humans' capacity to endure. Survival required skill, luck, and absolute refusal to quit. About physics and engineering. Sometimes simple design beats complex systems. Canvas that lets bullets pass proved superior to metal that creates lethal ricochets. Understanding your operational environment matters more than raw specifications. The stall speed paradox made POWs untouchable not despite their slowness, but because of it. Constraints force innovation. Limited resources produced the silent gliding tactic that no amount of German engineering could counter. The right tool isn't always the most advanced one. It's the tool that fits the mission. The German officer who laughed at women in crop dusters never understood what Nadezhda Popova and her sisters proved across 852 missions. That courage doesn't require the best equipment, that skill can overcome raw power, and that determination makes physics itself irrelevant. Her missions weren't just numbers. They were proof that Germans had calculated thrust, weight, speed, and firepower, but missed the variable that mattered most: the will to fight. In wooden biplanes that shouldn't have worked, against an enemy that refused to take them seriously until too late. The Night Witches proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the most powerful one. It's the one your enemy never sees coming.